Okay, so let's just unpack this. Imagine a headline that really should have stopped the global news cycle in its tracks. But maybe you only caught a flicker of it. Israel just became the first country in over 30 years to officially recognize Somaliland as an independent nation.
And this wasn't just some, minor diplomatic event. This was a geopolitical shockwave, a huge one. It's a move that happened supposedly under the banner of the Abraham Accords. But it immediately set off this unified, really fierce alarm bell all across Africa and the Middle East.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our whole mission here is to take the facts from our source material, which is a really solid AP News report, and just analyze this declaration. We need
Right.
to get the history here, understand why the African Union and other major powers just rejected this so fiercely, and what are these, quote, serious repercussions everyone's talking about.
Right. And for many of you listening, the first question is probably a pretty basic one. What exactly is Somaliland? And why did this thing that's been a non-issue for 30 years suddenly become front-page news?
It's a high-stakes collision, isn't it? It's a region's dream of independence, smashing up against this foundational African defense of existing borders. And then you have all these external strategic interests layered on top.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. The facts, the breakaway state itself.
Okay, so Somaliland. It's in East Africa, a region that declared itself separate from Somalia all the way back in 1991.
And you have to remember the context. This was during the complete descent into conflict that left the central Somali government, incredibly fragile and fragmented.
And that's where the story gets so strange. For 3 decades, this territory has basically acted like a country. They have their own government, it works, they have their own currency, a stable political system for the most part.
And yet, year after year, nothing. The UN, the African Union, every major international body just refused to recognize them.
So it's existed in this kind of diplomatic twilight zone, fully
Right.
functional on the inside, but totally invisible on the outside, until now, until that Friday declaration.
Correct. Israel became the very first country, after more than 30 years, to break that global consensus. The declaration was signed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Israeli foreign minister, and Somaliland's president.
And here's the part that really fueled the controversy. The declaration specifically says it was signed in the spirit of the Abraham Accords. Now, for anyone who needs a refresher, the Accords were all about normalizing ties between Israel and established Arab and Muslim majority countries.
So framing the Somaliland recognition under that banner is, well, it's a fascinating and, frankly, a very contentious choice. It suggests this is just an extension of that diplomatic project. But, and this is the crucial missing piece, according to our source, nobody knows why Israel did this right now, or, what they might be expecting in return for such a massive diplomatic move.
And that missing why is the real fuse, isn't it? Because the reaction wasn't slow, it wasn't localized, it was immediate, a unified continental repudiation.
Oh, absolutely. And the firestorm started exactly where you'd expect it to. With the federal government of Somalia, they immediately called the move unlawful, reaffirming their position that Somaliland is and always will be an integral part of Somalia's sovereign territory.
But the real story here is the institutional backlash. This went way beyond a dispute between Mogadishu and Hargeisa. It became a continental crisis, like overnight.
It did. The African Union's chairperson, Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, flatly rejected it. He said any attempt to undermine Somalia's sovereignty risks peace and stability on the entire continent. And that right there, that gets to the heart of African governance.
Right. Because when the AU talks about peace and stability, they're defending a very specific principle, aren't they? They're defending the idea that the map of Africa, the one inherited from the colonial era, is basically set in stone.
You've hit it exactly. It's a doctrine called uti posse datus. It's a Latin phrase. It means as you possess. After independence, all the new African nations basically agreed that these colonial borders, however messy they were, had to be maintained.
To avoid endless civil wars and border disputes.
Precisely. So if Somaliland is successfully recognized, it sets this incredibly dangerous precedent for other breakaway regions all over the continent.
So the AU sees this single act of recognition as a grenade tossed right into the heart of their entire stability mechanism.
It's an existential threat, and you saw that exact same defense from IGA, the main East African governing body. They didn't just reject it. They said it runs, and I'm quoting, contrary to the Charter of the United Nations and the agreements that establish both IGAD and the African Union.
So they're framing it as an illegal act?
Under both international and regional law, yes. And the condemnation didn't stop there.
Right. There was the joint statement, over 20 countries, mostly from the Middle East and Africa, plus the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
And their statement mentioned serious repercussions for peace and security in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. They see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
This isn't just about one region's status.
Okay, but hold on a second. Israel makes this move under the banner of the Abraham Accords, right? Promoting normalization. But then you have the U.S., a key partner in the Accords, immediately undercutting it.
And that is the huge diplomatic contradiction here. The U.S. State Department came out and publicly affirmed that it continues to recognize the territorial integrity of Somalia, which includes the territory of Somaliland.
So that puts Israel's biggest ally directly at odds with this specific move.
It completely isolates it. The norm of respecting Somalia's borders is holding firm, despite this one act of recognition.
To really get why the rejection was so huge and why everyone's afraid of these serious repercussions, we have to look at a map. This is all about geography.
It's all about location, location, location. Somaliland sits on the Gulf of Aden, and if you look at a global maritime map, this is one of the world's most critical shipping choke points. It connects the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean.
And right across the Gulf, you've got Yemen, a conflict zone that's already threatening global shipping. And next door to Somaliland, the tiny nation of Djibouti.
And Djibouti is, geopolitically speaking, probably the single most valuable piece of real estate in the Horn of Africa. It hosts major military bases for the U.S., China, France, Japan, all crammed into this tiny country because of its proximity to that waterway.
So any change to the status of the Somaliland coastline, which controls a huge chunk of that access to the Gulf of Aden, it immediately changes the security calculations for every major world power with a base in Djibouti.
Of course, the opposition sees this recognition not as some altruistic act, but as a strategic chess move. It's a way for an external power to get a foothold, to project influence in a very, very contested space.
And this fear of strategic maneuvering brings us to a really sensitive point that the opposition groups raised directly, the connection to Palestinian displacement.
Yes. That joint statement from the OIC and the African countries, it specifically rejected, and I'm quoting, any potential link between such measure and any attempts to forcibly expel the Palestinian people out of their land.
So they immediately feared this wasn't just about Somaliland. They saw it as part of a much larger and far more controversial strategy.
And that fear didn't just come from nowhere. The AP source notes that earlier in the year, U.S. and Israeli officials had told them that Israel had approached Somaliland about taking in Palestinians from Gaza. It was part of a broader, though eventually abandoned, U.S. plan at the time to resettle the population.
So the fact that this was even on the table, even if it didn't happen.
Exactly. It means that for regional powers, especially Arab and Muslim-majority states, they're viewing this recognition through that lens, through the lens of displacement and regional security anxieties.
It's just incredible how fast an African question of sovereignty can get tangled up in the strategic goals of external powers.
It is. And that brings us to the core of what you, the listener, really need to take away from all this. We've got the facts, the geography, the rejection. Now let's turn these into some critical analysis tools.
Okay, so let's start with the African side of this. We talked about the AU's defense of Somalia's territorial integrity. How does this one act of recognition challenge that foundational principle?
Oh, the challenge is profound. The AU's effectiveness really rests on its ability to enforce this principle of keeping colonial-era borders. If a major external power can just unilaterally recognize a breakaway state, it weakens the AU's authority, and it basically validates every separatist movement on the continent. The AU is fighting for its own survival here.
So if we assume for a minute that Israel's motivation is still unknown, what other benefits could they be looking for beyond military access? What economic or diplomatic leverage do they get given Somaliland's location?
Well, given the massive diplomatic cost, the reward has to be pretty significant. Maybe it's not a military base, but perhaps it's preferential trade access to that Gulf of Aden corridor. Or, and I think this is crucial, it's diplomatic leverage. By recognizing Somaliland, they've bought a very powerful bargaining chip to use against regional rivals. They're buying influence.
And finally, that U.S. rejection. How does the State Department's position complicate the whole Abraham Accords framework that Israel tried to use?
It creates a huge rift. I mean, Israel frames this as an act of normalization, a win for the Accords. But when a primary sponsor of the Accords, the U.S., rejects the outcome on the ground, it just completely undermines the political legitimacy of the move. It turns a victory lap into a unilateral disruption.
So when we pull all these threads together, what are the big takeaways for Africa's future?
First, this is a severe test of the authority of regional bodies like the AU and IGAD. Their unified rejection shows they get the stakes. The next few months will show if their collective voice is enough to reverse this.
And second,
Second, it just confirms that the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden are and will remain this critical geopolitical hotspot. It's a place where external powers will always seek leverage, and that often leads to more instability for the local states caught in the middle.
okay, here's where I think it gets really interesting. This deep dive shows that diplomatic recognition, or the lack of it, is never just about politics or paperwork. It's about strategic geography, it's about historical precedent, and it's about the very real fear of who gains leverage.
That's right. This one move by Israel makes Somaliland, a region that's been determined to chart its own course for 3 decades, the new focal point in this huge, complex battle over sovereignty and strategic influence. And it's a battle whose ripples will be felt far, far beyond the shores of the Gulf of Aden. They'll go right to the core principles that define the modern African state.